You who are check with your mute button, have your mute on unless you're speaking. And Alexandria, go ahead. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Amy. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's good to see you all. Thank you again for being here and for your commitment and service to this Advisory Council on Racial Justice. I'm going to start, as we start every meeting, acknowledging the Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache peoples, the traditional custodians of our land since time immemorial. I acknowledge the deep connections to the land and the significant contributions that have been made and continue to be made to the broader community statewide, and I honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations. I also acknowledge my ancestors at this time and invite you to honor and acknowledge your ancestors in this space as well. After every meeting, I start reading and taking note of what to include in our grounding for the work of the Council of Racial Justice. And without fail, by the time we meet every 2 weeks, there is more happening than I can keep track of. And so today, really present on my heart and felt really deeply, I know by many of us, is the number 545. Which is the number of children that was reported yesterday who have been taken away from their parents at the border and whose parents have not been located. And so I just want to offer a moment for us to pause and acknowledge this atrocity and hold that deeply as we think about this work in our state and the big systematic and institutional change that we're seeking to undertake. As always, I acknowledge and thank Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham and all of the incredible staff that are supporting this council right now and really allowing this work to happen, and each of you who are continuing to keep this work going forward. And so with that, we'll move right into our guest presenters for today. With us first, we have Barron Jones and Paige Fernandez from the ACLU New Mexico and ACLU nationwide, who are going to be talking about excessive force legislation. So Barron and Paige, welcome, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Yes, and make sure I'm off. Yeah. So thank you so much, Alexandria and Council, for having us here today. As Alexandria said, my name is Barron Jones. I'm the Senior Policy Strategist for the ACLU of New Mexico. I come to this work via necessity. I have many examples of interactions with law enforcement through my 100 years of living, and I decided that I needed to dedicate my time and energies to work in an environment where I can really affect change. I thought that this presentation was so important that I needed to tap someone from our national office. So I consulted with our national policing expert, Paige Fernandez, and really, tapped her to come in and sort of talk to you all about why we need this legislation and why we need to change our policies here in New Mexico. So take it away, Paige.
Thanks, Barron, and thanks everybody for having me. I'm really glad to be here and looking forward to talking about this really important subject with you all. Alexandria, I know that I wanted to pull up some slides and I was wondering if I could do that.
Yeah, Mary Lou or Amy, are we able to allow Paige to share their slides?
Yes, this is Mary Lou. Everybody should be able to share.
No, I don't see it on my end.
It's there, but it won't let me click on it. It's kind of like gray.
Can we make her a presenter?
as we're waiting, I can just introduce myself and tell you a little bit about my background. As Barron said, I am the Policing Policy Advisor at ACLU National. So that means that I oversee, coordinate, and lead on our state and local level police reform work. So we do policing work across the country, and I've had the honor of working with Barron for quite some time on policing in New Mexico, and I'm really excited to be here to chat with you all. Prior to joining the ACLU, I co-founded a nonprofit called Together We Stand that focused on dismantling racism, discrimination, and police brutality. And now I've been with the ACLU for almost 2.5 years. I see that I can share my screen, so I'm going to attempt to do that. Give me 1 second. Can you see? Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. So, as Barron said, we're here to talk a little bit today about the use of force legislation specifically in New Mexico. But I wanted to start with kind of a national framing to talk about where we are right now as a country around policing and police violence specifically.
Paige, I think you have your presentation on the presenter view rather than on the view for us.
Okay. So, give me 1 second. Sorry. WebEx is new to me. So what can you guys see on your screen?
We can see your slide and your next slide and the timing and all of that.
Okay. What about now?
There you go. That's perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Amazing. Look at that. So I wanted to start with kind of a national framing. Every year in the US, more than 1,000 people are killed by the police. So on average, police kill 3 people a day in this country. And we know that these killings don't impact all communities and populations the same. People of color and people with disabilities are disproportionately targeted by the police and face disproportionate risk when they interact with police. In order to kind of highlight the severity of the epidemic of police violence in the US, I wanted to focus on 1 year, so specifically 2018, in which there were 1,143 people killed by the police. Black people made up 25% of those killings, despite making up only 13% of the US population. And in addition, Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by the police than white people. And 21% of Black victims are unarmed compared to 14% of white victims. What exacerbates this issue and this epidemic of police violence in the US is a severe lack of accountability. As of 2020, 98.3% of killings have not resulted in officers being charged with the crime, and even fewer have resulted in officers being
Okay, so we're home safe. Oh, good.
Moreover, officers usually aren't held accountable even within their own police departments. So they're able to move easily from one police department to another. I'm hearing feedback. Is that on band?
I mean, when we took William off, he died within 5 minutes.
Mary Lou, we have you off mute.
I don't think that's until tonight.
Okay. So officers usually aren't held accountable even within their own departments, and they're often allowed to move easily from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, which is often the case we see with police officers who end up killing somebody, is that they've engaged in past misconduct and excessive uses of force, but are able to move so easily because there are no accountability mechanisms set up in place to protect the community members from police officers. This summer, I think, all of us realized what a huge problem we had to deal with. What a grave epidemic and on top of a pandemic that we have to deal with in this country. And the summer really highlighted how broken our policing system is, how pervasive police violence is in the US, and how prior reforms that people have tried to implement have failed. In March, Breonna Taylor was murdered in her home. In late May, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. These tragedies are compounded by the fact that none of these officers involved in these killings have been held accountable for their actions. No one has been charged in Breonna Taylor's case or George Floyd's case. Moreover, this summer, the ACLU National Office conducted a study that found that despite a once-in-a-lifetime public health crisis upending social norms and drastically decreasing physical interactions, police still managed to kill people at the same rate as before the outbreak of COVID-19. By June of 2020, police had killed more than they had in June of 2019. And as of October 14th, police had killed 861 people in the US. We found that these killings and injustices have propelled people to the streets, right? We witnessed protests in unprecedented numbers with people demanding transformational change in our policing institutions. And ACLU National is really proud to stand with Black-led grassroots organizations and nationwide organizations and community organizers who are demanding change. And we put together this summer a 3-part formula to end police violence. And one key part of that formula is to drastically transform use of force statutes so that use of force against community members is extremely rare, which is why we're here to talk to you today about that kind of legislation and how we can make that change happen. But before we dive into the legislation specifically, I want to hand it over to Barron to talk about New Mexico and specifically police violence in New Mexico.
Yeah, thank you for that, Paige. For, just I think this week or in the last 7 or 8 days, there have been, I think, 3 or 4 police shootings around the state and communities from Las Vegas all the way up I-25. And it just sort of indicates and sort of speaks to the reality that New Mexico has had the highest rate for police shootings, fatal police shootings and killings in any place in the nation. And when you look at the number, I think like per capita, individuals, New Mexicans have a 11.9% chance of being killed by law enforcement, right? And the next state, Oklahoma, which we know is a pretty quite punitive state when it comes to law enforcement, are far below us by a couple points. Racial disparities in police killings in New Mexico are also, super stark. The average annual police killings rate for Black people is like 15%, and Latinx folks are 11% compared to 7.8 of white folks. And excuse all the numbers there, but we just know that this phenomenon takes place because, as Paige pointed out, the over-targeting of communities of color. Finally, just looking at the numbers of lives lost between January 2013 and 2019, 142 people have been killed. Excuse me, I gotta look at my notes for that. Excuse me, yeah, 42 people have been killed, and just this year alone, 117 people have been killed by police. I think it was 2018. Despite, we, and Paige will touch on this a little bit more, but after, 2018, we led the nation, we had the highest number of police-involved shootings in the country and in our previous history, despite the Department of Justice coming in 2012 and doing a very intense investigation and discovering that our largest police department, APD, had a pattern of practice of engaging in use of force in violation of the U.S. Constitution. At the conclusion of that investigation, As many of you all know, they agreed to the Casa Court approved settlement agreement. And that agreement mandated that the Albuquerque Police Department revamp their use of force policies. So right now we have those policies just went into effect, I think sometime in early January, where the department is now required to use a reasonable necessary standard opposed to a standard that just say that what's going on in that time. And why this is important is that, and Paige will talk on this some more, is that we have great policies in some places, but really, ensuring that those policies are followed and we have mechanisms to hold folks accountable for violating those policies call issues, right? And just recently, as Paige touched on, and as the Department of Justice investigation, brought to the top, is that folks with disabilities are being killed at alarming rates, right? And I think in the recent months, in the last 6 or 7 months, we've had 2 instances where individuals called law enforcement seeking help for loved ones who were living with mental health, suffering from mental health crisis. One of those individuals, his name is on the screen, so excuse me for reading off the screen, but Valente Acosta Bastillos. He was killed during a welfare check and back in March, right, when we were settling in for this for our sequestration under the pandemic. Max Mitnick, his family called so they could get his son, who wanted at the time to go to their mental health provider, and things just escalated really quickly out of control, and he was shot and recovering, and he's recovering from that. And then one of our one of the state's champions for police accountability reform, Elaine Maestas lost her sister, Alicia Lucero, who was shot 21 times in July after her family called the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office. These are just certain examples from around the state. We've seen in Las Cruces where the gentleman was killed in a similar fashion to George Floyd. So there's a lot of this going on. And really, and Paige, I'm going to turn this back over to Paige now so she can talk a little bit about the need for strict use of force legislation. And excuse me, y'all, I'm all shaky.
Thanks, Barron. So I was going to say quickly, but it's not going to be that quick. I'm going to lengthily talk about the importance of use of force legislation and what we're trying to do in New Mexico. So most state statutes, including New Mexico's, do not make it clear that police officers should only use deadly force as a last result when they don't have any other options. Our current models on use of force are keyed to the Graham standard, which is based on a U.S. Supreme Court decision, Graham versus Connor. And the Graham standard is the overall Fourth Amendment standard that applies to all uses of force, lethal and less lethal. It permits officers to use whatever force is, and I quote, objectively reasonable in the light of the facts and circumstances confronting them, regardless of their good or evil intentions, and even if lesser levels of force or actions not involving force at all were available and could have addressed the threat that they are facing. So basically what this means is that on the federal level in the US, the legal standards allow for lethal force to be used even when it is not necessary to respond to the threat posed to the officer or other civilians. What matters is whether another officer in the same circumstances would consider the force used to be a reasonable response. These current standards on the federal level and on the state level are so vague. It's the standard we see in New Mexico is similar to the ones we see in states across the country. It's similar to our federal level standard, which is just, it is so vague that it allows police to use deadly force too often, even when it isn't necessary and when deadly force wasn't the only option. And this is why it is so important for us to change the lethal use of force standard in New Mexico to ensure force is only used when necessary. So our legislative objective, by our, I mean mine and Barron's, the ACLU's, ACLU of New Mexico's, is to pass legislation in New Mexico that raises the lethal use of force standard from a reasonable standard to a necessary standard, ensuring that deadly force is only used as an absolute last resort after exhausting all other reasonable alternatives to defend against imminent threats to human life. There are a few components in a use of force bill that we'd like to see implemented in 2021. And these are highlighted in yellow on your screen. First, we need clear limits on the use of force. So we need a bill that ensures that lethal force is only used as a last resort when necessary to defend against imminent threats to human life. Second, we need legislation that has a requirement of de-escalation before using lethal force, with an emphasis on exhausting all other reasonable alternatives before using lethal force. Finally, we need a requirement that when reviewing cases of uses of force, that the conduct leading up to the killing is considered. And this is so incredibly important. This totality of circumstances provision is so important. It means an inclusion of tactics used by the officers should be involved in any evaluation of the officer's conduct. We should always be looking at the totality of circumstances, everything that happened. And this provision would allow for us to hold officers accountable in the rare circumstances that they do use force. Finally, there are two other important policy changes I just want to touch on as we're talking about police violence. First is abolishing qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is something of a kind of dinner table term that's now been popularized across the country, which is exciting that people are finally talking about it. But for folks who don't know, it's a legal doctrine that shields all government officials, but is talked often about in the context of policing. It shields them from being held personally liable for constitutional violations, including the right to be free from excessive police use of force, for money damages under federal law, so long as the official did not violate clearly established case law. This standard shields law enforcement in particular from innumerable constitutional violations each year. In the Supreme Court's own words, it protects, and I quote, all but the plainly incompetent or those who knowingly violate the law. Recently, Colorado abolished it. Finally, talking about banning no-knock warrants. These types of warrants, which resulted in the murder of Breonna Taylor, allow for police to enter people's homes without announcing themselves or making their presence or reason for being there known. These are disproportionately targeted and used against people of color and are extremely dangerous, as demonstrated in the case of Breonna Taylor.
May I ask something, Paige, about the qualified immunity? Because, when it comes to the legislative session and it comes time to passing laws, there's going to be a tremendous amount of pushback regarding abolishing qualified immunity, right? And I just want to just let this set with people. Qualified immunity only comes into play when it has been established that someone's civil rights has been violated. So I just want that to sit with folks there for a moment. And excuse me for interrupting you, Paige.
No, thank you for raising that, Barron. And this is an incredibly important issue that, it's work around qualified immunity, I think, is particularly exciting because it provides for kind of a left-right coalition work, and is something that is being fought for on the federal level by libertarians, Democrats, Republicans alike, and is something that is absolutely necessary to happen at the state level as well. So the question lies, how will this save lives? Yes, this legislation is important, but why is it so important? Studies have found that police departments with policies that place clear restrictions on when and how officers can use force had significantly fewer killings than those that did not have restrictions in place. So departments that require officers to exhaust all other reasonable alternatives before relying on lethal use of force saw a 25% reduction in police killings per capita, and departments that require de-escalation saw a 15% reduction in police killings per capita. Furthermore, officers in police departments with more restrictive policies in place are actually less likely to be killed in the line of duty, less likely to be assaulted, and have similar likelihood of sustaining an injury. Moreover, Campaign Zero found that police departments with more restrictive use of force policies have similar crime rates, including similar violent crime rates, as police departments with less restrictive use of force policies. So these policies have absolutely no ties to crime levels. Finally, this type of legislation is being discussed, drafted, and implemented across the country. Colorado and Vermont, most recently this year, have passed new use of force statutes that are incredibly strong, requiring de-escalation. I think New Mexico can go above and beyond their standard, though, and make an even stronger standard. California in 2019 passed AB 392, which was a really groundbreaking piece of use of force legislation. States like Maryland and Connecticut are also working on passing this legislation in 2021. Additionally, on the federal level, Representatives Clay and Khanna have introduced the Peace Act to change the federal standard on lethal use of force from a reasonable to a necessary standard. And the Biden campaign has made implementing strong use of force federal legislation one of their criminal justice priorities. So that's about it from me. I'm going to toss it back to Barron to quickly talk about how y'all can help us out. Oh, Barron, you're muted still.
Yeah, so excuse me, I'm a mess. But there's quite a few things you all can do to help out, especially folks who are outside of the center of Albuquerque. You know, many of our criminal legal system, bills and laws are Albuquerque centric. I know Mr. Cotton's on the call, and so I think if we can educate folks in our communities and just sort of talk to them about this super important issue, and really, just bring folks into the fold, especially the folks like I mentioned who are on the call from places like Clovis, where police, adverse police interactions and violence sort of go under the radar in our state, right? Because they're not in a huge population center. So we only necessarily hear about them when there is a tragic loss of life, unfortunately. So we need to nip that in somehow. And then, but most importantly, please, could I, implore on you all to, make a favorable recommendation to the governor, to pass sensible use of force laws. And one other thing I would like to see in the use of force law in our state that I was spacey when Paige was going through it is some sort of mechanism to sort of identify if for data collection and to see if police are profiling folks. I think so if we can come up with a system, and I'm sorry you're never supposed to introduce anything in the last minute, so I apologize about that. But we need some sort of mechanism where the line officers are, sort of filling out a form for why they stopped people, what was the resolution of that stop, and things like that. So we can sort of examine to see if our policing practices are creating disparities. So I think that's all I have, but please, this is really important. If you all have any, questions at all about this or need any resources at all, let me know. Let me know if you have an organization and you want us to talk about this stuff. Let me know so we can get as many people involved in this this really, really important work, because lives are being lost and it's unnecessary loss of life. Thank you all for allowing us to talk with you today.
Thank you, Aaron and Paige. I'm going to open the floor for questions from council members. So if you'll use the raise hand feature under panelist.
We also have quite a few people in our audience today. And so there are some questions coming through the Q&A as well. So I can look at those, or you can look at those, Alexandria, whichever.
Amy, if you'll manage that, and then I will keep an eye on the participant list.
Sounds good. One of our first questions was, can you show the first slide again that had the stats on it?
Yes, I can. Give me 1 second.
And also, there's one before that one in the list of the studies. So if we can drop those in the chat, if people can see them, I think I can work on that.
Is this the one? And I should flag that we have this graphic right here. A lot of databases, like the Washington Post database, only collects police killings via shooting. And so this number, the staggering number of almost 5,500 lives lost over the course of 5 years in the US at the hands of police, is actually only people who were shot and killed by police. There's many more people who were killed in manners like George Floyd by chokehold or other policing tactics.
I also see that there was a question asked by Janine as to whether we could have a list of the studies that were mentioned in the presentation. So
I can drop an entire list of resources and studies into the chat or send them to somebody to circulate with everyone.
If you could send them to Amy, then she can circulate them to the council.
Okay, I can do that.
Thank you.
Paige, also, could you drop them in the chat so the public, so folks who are just watching along can see?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop sharing for a second so I can share those resources.
Thank you. Fatima, I see your hand, and then Terrence.
Hi, good afternoon. First, I just want to say thank you to you both. That was such an informative presentation. I really appreciate, especially hearing about the New Mexico context. So one of the things, that we're seeing from the subcommittees that are looking at law enforcement, the subcommittees of this kind of broader body, is there's a working group around training requirements for law enforcement. And, we hear a lot nationally, police need training. What does that look like? And then, the data shows training also doesn't work. So I just wanted to ask you both, in your expert opinions, if from the ACLU's perspective, there's an approach around that, or if that's really not what we should be focusing on, or if you all have an opinion around that, just given your expertise.
I can get first from a local context, going back to the court-approved settlement agreement that the city of Albuquerque entered into with the Department of Justice. The part of that agreement recommended some really robust policies to get at policing, to get at use of force. But where I think the breakdown is, because even when you go back and you look at Minnesota, prior to the George Floyd killing, that was one of the most progressive policing reform places in the nation, right? And George Floyd still ended up dead. So I think what happens is that there's a lack of mechanism or will to come up with a system to enforce and hold law enforcement officials accountable when they violate those policies. I think if anyone had the appetite for it, they can look at the APD Forward's website and just sort of track the independent monitoring team's reports, and you will see. And I'm just using Albuquerque as an example. That we came and they're in primary compliance with which means they identify the policies. Secondary training is compliance, which means that they got everyone trained. But the last part of that last piece is operational compliance and coming up with mechanisms to hold police officers accountable. And I'm sure Paige can speak more about that. But there's always what the monitor refers to as the counter CASA effect. Law enforcement, the culture doesn't necessarily allow for them to buy into I don't know if I'm using the right words, allow, but it sort of impedes them or creates barriers for them buying into the cultural change, if that makes any sense. So I would say, because the first thing everyone says is training. You train folks until they're blue in the face, but if they don't believe in it, and if you have officers, or command level officers thwarting the progress, it'll never change. And I'm sorry for being pessimistic like that. I should never use the word never.
I think you're absolutely right, Barron. And I'll just say, from a national perspective, I think there are 2 points I want to make. And the first is, we don't have legal standards to hold police officers to, and we don't have tight legal constraints on the activities that they can engage in and the force that they can use. We can train them all day and night, as Barron was saying, but nothing will happen. There will be no system of accountability. There will be no law for us to point to say, you needed to have done this, this, and this. It's just the training that they received. I will also say that I think, it is not in our interest to fund more training programs for police. Police have robust budgets. Police departments have robust budgets. And so if the discussion is, do we need to put more money into training? The answer should be no. If they want to change their training to emphasize de-escalation, I think that's great, but they should be reallocating the existing pots of money that they have to do so.
Thank you. Terrence, and then Janine, and then Rabbi.
Thank you, Barron and Paige, for your time. I do agree. It does take the top for change to happen. If the top's not engaged, nothing's going to happen. My question comes about police unions, because they have some influence over policy. And obviously, qualified immunity is going to be a big issue. What is your experience, or what have you heard about the unions? Because I know it's probably shaken up a lot around the nation. And I was wondering if you kind of elaborate on that, if you have any idea.
You want to go first, Paige?
Sure. Yeah, I can talk about this. This is something that ACLU National is actually really excited about, and we're trying to build out. Excited is probably not the right word when talking about police unions, but we are looking forward to engaging in advocacy around police union abuse of power. I think, you're absolutely right that police unions, they play, when I talk about police unions' power, I talk about it both internally and externally. First, police unions have an internal power within police departments and with individual officers, whereby they block a lot of accountability and transparency. So a lot of police union contracts have incredibly problematic provisions, such as not allowing for officers to be interrogated after a police killing for 72 hours, giving officers access to body cam footage and witness statements before interrogation, completely erasing misconduct records after a few years. So I think, have that internal power where they're able to shield officers within their union from any form of accountability. But then they have an external power that I think is really a battle that we need to think about when we're talking about, bold transformational state legislation, is that police unions have an incredible amount of money and they provide a lot of funding for political campaigns on the left and the right. And so there is a battle. We come up against them. We've come up against them in all of our use of force battles, and you're absolutely right that we're coming up against them in our work on qualified immunity. But there are ways to work around the powers that they have, and I should also say that we're not against unions in any way, shape, or form, right? We think that officers can have good benefits, good pay, and safety protections that we want everybody who works to have, but they have an excessive power, too much power, and often abuse that power.
Can I say, here on the local level, our largest, the union for the Albuquerque Police Officers Association union, they're pretty powerful sort, but I think what we can do is just sort of be vigilant and work in the future to change and to have more of a public process during collective bargaining and things like that. I think we at the ACLU of New Mexico is a part of APD Forward, and our that coalition, if you aren't familiar with it, is comprised of several community serving organizations, Albuquerque Healthcare for the Homeless, New Mexico Criminal Defense Lawyers Association, Disabilities Rights, and for the last 6 years, we have sort of worked to oversee the reforms of the Albuquerque Police Department. And when it was time to implement the use of force policies that they now have, which are, they're pretty decent. Of course, there's always room for improvement, right? There was a lot of pushback. So the unions, like Paige was saying, here in Albuquerque or across the nation, they carry a lot of weight. But I don't feel like it's a defeatist or going down a rabbit hole to try to challenge them and sort of change the way those contracts are worked out. And like I mentioned, to have more of a public process. I know there's organizations across the nation that are fighting for participatory bargaining, right? And we can do things like that in New Mexico to sort of change the stronghold that police unions have on reform. I hope I answered the question. I just started talking.
No,
Thank you. I am going to go to, we have just a few minutes left with Barron and Paige. So Janine, I believe, did you still want to ask a question or comment? And then, okay. Okay, great. Thank you, Janine. And so we'll go to Rabbi for our final question.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate this presentation. I'm participating in the subcommittee that's actually going to be addressing this issue and the specific legislation here in New Mexico. And at our last meeting, we heard about the difference between deadly and excessive force and the implication of those definitions in the politics surrounding moving the legislation forward for New Mexico, police seeming to prefer the deadly force definition because it excuses them of responsibility if the suspect, for example, has an unknown medical condition that may contribute to the death of the person in custody. So I'm wondering if you can comment on that, because the deadly force definition, which the police prefer, allows them to claim mitigating circumstances, so the cases can be argued in their favor. And since that is getting into the weeds and that's about where we're about to go, we'd really appreciate your thoughts on that.
Paige, that's definitely a Paige question right now.
Yeah, I can take that. This is, sorry, I just saw another question pop up in the chat that I can quickly answer as well if we have time. But yeah, this is really interesting. I actually haven't heard of this specific definitional dynamic before, but granted, I should first just say that every definition of lethal, deadly, and excessive force looks different in every piece of legislation I've ever looked at. It varies by state, it varies within state depending on what legislation you're looking at. So I think it's really important about how you define it, because I think there are a lot of different understandings of it. I think when we're thinking about what allows police officers to mitigate responsibility, I think that's when, when we were talking about kind of the three important prongs to have in use of force legislation, that's why I emphasize the totality of circumstances so much, right? Because if somebody did have a medical condition, if the police show up and just have, guns blazing and are ready to go and don't even take the time to look at somebody's family member and say, hey, for example, if the person was hard of hearing and couldn't hear the police officer's commands, did they take the time to ask somebody, a family member or a friend who might have called the cops in, hey, what, can he hear me? Can they hear me? And I think it's that emphasis on totality of circumstances, something we fought so desperately to keep in the California piece of legislation we worked on in 2018 and 2019, was because it doesn't allow officers to say, oh, there was a medical condition we didn't know about. They're often able to do this, and this is why there are over I think it is over 30% of people who are killed by the police have some type of disability. And, you know, in very rare cases, are officers held accountable for harming these people because they're exactly what you're saying. They're able to say, oh, I had no idea, right? And so that's why we put this totality of circumstances phrase in there. What did they do leading up to that use of force? Did they try to figure out what was going on, why somebody wasn't being responsive, why somebody wasn't following their directions? And I think that's really key here. And then do we have time that I could answer the one question in the chat about the few other states?
Sure.
Yes, few other states have passed this on the state level. This has been done on the city and county level. Some of the resources I just shared with Amy, I would advise everybody to go to Mapping Police Violence. It's a website run by Campaign Zero, and ACLU works very closely with Campaign Zero. I check out Mapping Police Violence and Use of Force Project by Campaign Zero. And you can look at use of force policies in the 100 biggest police departments across the country. And you'll see in the final slide, or one of the slides that I shared, there was a sharp decline in police killings in cities and counties that have implemented this kind of strong, strict language around when lethal force can be used. So you can dive in and see which places have those strong policies and which aspects of their policies are strong as well.
And I would like to add, when the rabbi presented the course, and I immediately pulled up the Albuquerque Police Department use of force policies, and they do not define excessive force at all. And I thought that was interesting. So I'm going to be doing a deeper dive into the Mapping Police Violence 100 police reports to see how common that is. So I appreciate you all so much.
Thank you. We appreciate you, Barron and Paige, for being here. And I just had one, I think, a quick question. Do you have a bill sponsor for the 2021 session?
No, and I'm working really fiercely to do it. I haven't. So yeah, I would love to rap with you off. I would love to rap with you about that, but we're working on it. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, because I may need some support. No, so.
Thank you so much for being here. And if there are any other resources you want to provide, and same for the council, if there are questions that come up, and we can send those to you all to keep the conversation going. We really appreciate your time today.
Okay, yeah, and I want to emphasize, and I think we did in the work. We are a resource. So if there's anything that you all need, believe me, you send it to my email. I'm gonna really farm it out to make sure you get it in a timely manner, because the work you all are doing is like super important to saving lives and ending chaos. So I appreciate you all taking your time out to do this work.
Thank you so much. It was great to have you. Take good care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. We are now going to move to our next presenter and guest, Matt Baca with the New Mexico Attorney General Office. This is in follow-up to a conversation we had a few meetings ago with Alice and Gary about seclusions and restraints in school. So hello, Matt, welcome. Thank you for being with us today. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you all for hosting me today to talk a little bit about our work and the perspectives that we bring to this issue. Thank you, Amy, for pulling me into this conversation. I don't have a formal presentation, but I'll start by giving you some background information about the AG's office's involvement in this space, sort of where we come from and the work that we're doing on this issue. So for a little bit of global context, we participate in a working group of state attorneys general, probably about 20 to 25 state AGs, that is facilitated by the National Center for Youth Law on civil rights issues in the education space in general. So we deal with many issues around the school to prison pipeline, and of course, discipline in the form of restraint and seclusion is front and center in that conversation. On the more local level, our interest in these cases has come from prosecutorial work that we're directly engaged in where there have been excessive uses of force by either school resource officers or police officers against students, and in particular students of color. There's one case in particular where there's a Hispanic male who was brutalized by a school resource officer, and a Black student in the northwest corner of the state that we are also currently investigating and prosecuting a case related to. So we kind of come from both a policy lens, where we do a lot of work with our state AG colleagues in trying to address issues of discipline and equity in the space across the country. And then we, have a sort of direct stake in the enforcement of inappropriate uses, or I shouldn't say enforcement, but the prosecution of inappropriate uses of force in a school context. So I think that sort of gives the group a little bit of a sense of where we come from here. In the actual statutory scheme, most of the oversight of restraint and seclusion in public schools is actually designated to the public education department. And then, of course, there are responsibilities at the district level across the state. So while we don't play a direct role there, again, as the things I just brought up sort of inform why we have an interest in this. So with that in mind, we began working on a piece of legislation, and I see Senator Lopez is in the chat as well, with Senator Lopez, that would directly look at some legislative reform on these issues. I don't know how familiar the group is with the bill that was introduced in this past session, and I understand that Senator Lopez intends to introduce it again in this coming session. But the broad strokes are that it would, outright ban the use of seclusion techniques in New Mexico. Many of the civil rights organizations that we work with, the State AG Working Group, provided us a bunch of resources for best practices across the country. And I'm sorry, I'll just back up for 2 seconds and say that that's kind of where the bill itself and the drafting of the policies in the bill come from, is best practices from some federal not had any success. So outright ban seclusion, severely limit restraint that used in schools, medicated restraint, banning mechanical restraint absent any sort of prescribed mechanism by a medical personnel that would give that student, that individual, the need to use mechanical restraint. And then it would increase reporting of the instances of it. And the way we looked at it was twofold. We wanted to really see parental engagement a lot sooner than the law currently allows for. We wanted to see this type of reporting go out to a parent or a guardian of a child in a school who restraint was used against them, being notified quite quickly, immediately if possible, but no sooner than 24 hours, where I think there was some more lax reporting standards. And then we also wanted to create a more robust reporting mechanism to the department, so that there's collection of data and information that the department is getting at the statewide level on individual school and district level instances of restraint and seclusion. All of this is informed by data that I'm sure that you all are intimately familiar with by now. But the data, even at the statewide level, tracks everything that we see in terms of over-policing of students of color in public school settings. So where discipline, typically you'll see a minority population that represents, less than 20% of a school's entire population, but they receive 40% of the discipline in that school. You really see the same thing in the restraint and seclusion context. The CRDC's most recent data, which is a few years old at this point, but they have at least a little bit of state level data for New Mexico, and it tracks exactly that. Indigenous students are overwhelmingly restrained or secluded compared to their colleagues, the same with Black students. And then another issue that Attorney General Balderas was very interested in, because it touches on both the prosecutorial examples that I bring up, is the disparate impact on students with disabilities. One thing that you see in both the nationwide data and what state level data we do have is that there are disproportionate uses of restraint and seclusion against students that have disabilities. And both of the cases that we're working on right now exhibit that, where you have either a school resource officer or a law enforcement officer who is just not at all appropriately responding to the needs of the individual student in that given context. So again, that sort of colors both our interest in the issue and sort of where we are in terms of the work that our office has done so far with Senator Lopez. I'm looking at a couple of the other questions that Amy sent to me. I think that just about covers it. You know, the suggestions that I would have for the council is to follow the work that Senator Lopez is putting forward, that we've worked with her on, and look at really what should be relatively easy fixes in the law that should not be controversial in terms of banning seclusion. If we want to get into the minutia, there are exceptions for using like normal detention or things like that, where a teacher would need to discipline a student, but not seclude them from their classmates or would not isolate them in a way that was psychologically damaging to the student. And then again, I spoke a little bit about the specifics of the restraints. The work is really trying to limit the types of restraints that can be used by anybody in the school, whether it's school personnel or a resource officer. So yeah, that is a 30,000 foot view of what our interest in this work is, sort of the information that we come to it with, and the work that's being done so far. Like I said, I don't have anything particularly more formal than that. I'm happy to sort of just have a dialogue with the group and see if there are things that you all are already looking at that we might give an informed perspective on, or that we can be helpful on. And then, as I did with one of the other subcommittees, of course, avail myself and our office of anything that this group needs from us or would like to see from us in terms of partnership and looking at ways to advance these issues. So really, that's what I've got so far, and I would, kind of kick it back to you all, and see if there are questions or anything you'd like to talk about.
Thanks so much, Matt. Really appreciate that overview. And so I'll open for questions if you raise your hand. And Amy, if you'll help if there's any in the Q&A.
Yes. I know, Matt, one question that had come up, which is one of the reasons why I had asked you to come, was around reporting and how many of the schools are actually in the AG's office doing or providing correct reporting or complete reporting.
So since we do not have a reporting function that comes to us directly, I can't give you a number there. When we were doing the research on the reforms that we wanted to see, I can tell you without being able to point to this specific data, that the feedback that we were getting, anecdotal or otherwise, was that the reporting was woefully inadequate, that really the reports that either are happening at the district level or getting to PED are just not timely enough, and then may not be happening at all. So this is one of those instances where I think from our perspective, and I'll step out of my lane a little bit here in so saying, and this is absolutely no disrespect to the department, but I think one thing we'd like to see is, we know those reporting requirements exist in some form or fashion, but what we'd really like to see is a more robust reporting mechanism, partnership with someone like our office or another more appropriate entity, then we'd really like to see how reporting can be more timely and again more robust, so that we can really start to ferret out pattern and practice issues or any of the things that we aren't seeing because we do, what we get is sort of piecemeal.
Thank you. And I should have asked Senator Lopez, did you have anything that you wanted to add about the bill that you're sponsoring?
the opportunity. And Matt, thank you so much for your presentation. This is, it's an issue that all of our communities have experienced over many years. When you talk about reporting, some of us don't feel comfortable with the numbers that the public education department has, not current, but even in the past years, as to truly what's really happening when we talk about restraints, seclusions, and such. There's also, I think, other issues that we also have to focus on when we talk about our school resource officers. That's another area of policing that does take place in our public school system. Albuquerque Public Schools comes in front of the legislature many a time over, asking to become their own police department. I've been, an advocate saying, no, this is not going to happen. But in context of that, when you have a school resource officer, many a times there's a memorandum of understanding in the Albuquerque Public Schools that's between Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office and Albuquerque Public Schools. But then you look at our charter schools, which there are many across the state. When we talk about oversight as to what they do for restraints and seclusions, but also how this lends itself into for those who are being suspended. I mean, it's all kind of in that same circle as to what happens when you begin to, in my estimation, criminalize the students for whatever other reasons. It could be mental health issues, whatever may be happening in their lives. That we have this other factor that comes in. As Matt mentioned, there are staff in the schools. It could be anybody that comes in to remove a child and puts them into a place to hold them. These are many instances that do happen here in Albuquerque Public Schools, but I know I've heard some back over on all different parts of our state. And this is in working with the Attorney General's office. We want to make sure that we change this. A few years back, we did amend the seclusion and restraints legislation, but this particular bill will, I think, take it to where I think the original intent was, because sometimes when you negotiate back and forth, you give away the real intent of what the bill actually was. And that's my personal perspective, and that we need to take it back to where it was. What we need to do to safeguard all of our children. And again, our children of color are the recipients, and you can look at the numbers. They're there and they support it. And just one final comment I'd like to make is we'll have this bill in front of the Legislative Education Study Committee, most likely in December, just because we're backing up, of course, but we'll also have this presentation in front of the LESC coming in December too. So thank you.
And Alexandria, if I might just add quickly onto that point, I think what's also very helpful to sort of parse out is exactly as the senator said. We view this as the beginning of the school to prison pipeline problem, right? But we also want to focus very heavily on just elemental notions of student safety when we talk about restraint and seclusion. And this is particularly necessary when you're talking about students who have disabilities, who are being responded to by people that often lack the training to understand what that disability means in the moment and the way that they need to respond to it as a result of it. And so the other, another piece of policy reform that we've been trying to work on at the AG's office and that Attorney General Balderas would really like to see is how we create intersections of the educational space with the public safety space, so that when you have a student that has an IEP, for instance, the school has a tremendous amount of information on the needs of that student with respect to delivery of educational services. A large gap when it comes to responding to safety incidents with that same student, where there isn't any individualized or particularized response often by public schools or by law enforcement if the student is engaged in some sort of disciplinary scenario. So I think it's important, and I appreciate the senator's point there to say, this is a continuum of problems, but we should also focus on this particular problem just from a pure personal safety aspect in terms of keeping students safe in schools. And then, of course, because we know of the disparate impact of these issues on minority populations, then we should simultaneously do the work to ensure that they are not weaponized against students of color. So just adding a little point there.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And we have time, so that's totally good. Terrence, I see your hand.
I hope I remember my question. Matt, thank you for your time. I greatly appreciate it. The case, I'm familiar with the case up north. My daughter actually brought me the YouTube video, so it kind of stands out quite a bit. Has the AG's office thought about, in these cases, really having social work involved with these officers and having them take more of the lead instead of having these officers respond to things of this nature?
I think that's a great point. And I think it's something that to address with leaders like Senator Lopez to say, what is actually the role of law enforcement in schools? You know, I think that in most instances where there is no threat of violence to the student or to anyone around them, that I don't think anybody would disagree that we need to look at it from a service leadership lens, for lack of a better way to put it. And what I mean by that is, what does this student actually need? What is the real cause of this event? And how do we provide something to this student so that we can de-escalate the situation, but then we can also look at how there might be something more systemic in this person's life, and how we can help them to overcome that, so that individual instances are being addressed, but while there's a more systemic or a holistic look at it. So I think it's a fantastic point, and I think it's definitely something that needs to be evaluated. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments for Matt at this time? When Alice and Gary presented to us last month, one of the things that they talked about was a study that was done in Massachusetts, and they said that New Mexico may need to recommend that we have a study done because we don't have any reliable data, or we have not interpreted the data that we do have to really tell us about the incidence and pervasiveness of this. And is there any plan to introduce a memorial or anything to have a study done regarding this?
I think that's a fair point, and I think that's something that should be absolutely looked at. And it looked like Senator Lopez just say, I think from our perspective, the reporting would hopefully create the robustness of the data set. Of course, it's all about what you get and then how you analyze it. But that absolutely sounds like a good idea.
And if I may make mention, Alexandria and team, is that we will have a memorial asking for some more specifics as to what the numbers truly are as they regard suspensions, any type of association that we are talking about as it affects all of our children, but even those, of course, with a disability. So we just need to, I think we need some real numbers, hard data also for us to look at. We haven't had it for quite a while, so let's see what we can get, hopefully after we pass the memorial this session for next interim.
Thank you.
And Alexandria, I would just add to that point, I'm not quite sure what the breadth of the Massachusetts study was, but, if you do, my humble suggestion is that if you do sort of view these things on a spectrum of problems, starting with restraint and seclusion in the school setting that morphs into other forms of discipline and their disparate impacts on particular student populations, then it seems to me that it could be part of a much broader study of discipline issues in public school settings beyond just restraint and seclusion, but also to include, expulsion, suspension, things like that.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments for Matt or Senator Lopez? Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Matt.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Okay, I think we will then move to subcommittee report outs. So we can start with Shawnee.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Let me pull up my little notes here. So last week, the Public Safety and Law Enforcement Subcommittee met with Director Kelly Alzaharna of the New Mexico Law Enforcement Academy, as well as Matt Baca from the Attorney General's Office. They had a discussion on training curriculum requirements and the politics of how that curriculum is decided and dictated by the board at the Law Enforcement Academy. The subcommittee working groups that my subcommittee split into, not my subcommittee, the one that I staff, let me be clear on that. They are gathering suggestions that are going to be submitted to our chair by close of business today. And those are going to be discussed in the subcommittee meeting tomorrow. And there is no presenters scheduled for that meeting tomorrow. So it's just going to be the subcommittee members diving into their recommendations and suggestions and having some time set aside to focus purely on that. Looking ahead, next week on the 29th, we will be hearing from CYFD Deputy Director Nick Costales on juvenile justice. And I'm about 85% sure that we should have Chief of Police Robert Thornton in to present as well. I do not have that confirmation from him. I did speak with him on the phone last week, and I'm waiting to hear back from an email. So that's what's coming up on the 29th. And on November 12th, we will have an update from Stephanie Salazar from IAD on a report that the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Task Force will be completing. So after that report is complete, they will come in to present to the subcommittee. Aside from that, based on the subcommittee's decision to have these kind of suggestions rough in, they should be discussing those tomorrow. So they're hoping to have suggestions for the full council very soon. And also reports and answers from the corrections department. That was the combined health and public safety law enforcement meeting. Those I just got earlier today. I have sent them out to my subcommittee as well as Kaylee, who will send them out to her subcommittee folks. And that might take a little time just because the files are kind of big. So we had to play around back and forth on how to make those fit best. That is all I have on my end.
Thank you, Shawnee. Any questions or comments for Shawnee? All right, we'll go to Tammy in education.
Hi. We had our last meeting on October 15th last week. We did have Rachel Gedgel, I can't pronounce her last name, Jadel, the director of LFC. Also presenting was Dr. John Courtney, the deputy director, as well as Kelly Clunt, the principal analyst of LSC, and then Don Iglesias, the chief economist. They did talk about the Early Childhood Trust Fund. We also talked about the Land Grant Permit Fund and the distribution and the beneficiaries, and that's really pertaining to FY20. We also had Bill Jordan presenting, and he is from the New Mexico Voices for Children, and he spoke on the permanent land grant and the early childhood education as well. And then lastly, we had Sina Flanagan from PED. Now she was telling us about teacher licensure. What we were looking at is the racial bias training or any ethnic studies. Is that required through their licensure? We did with our subcommittees get for the regents. We have already submitted that, and that is the questions and also the process of choosing the regents for upcoming. So that is a win for us. Now, our next committee meeting will be October 29th, and that particular meeting will be going over the priorities. So we'll go over our short and long-term goals and really focusing on that. We've had a lot of information that was brought to our last committee, so we still need to filter through that and get our priorities and focus on that. And I think that's where we are.
Thank you, Tammy. Any questions, comments for Tammy? Great. Now we'll move to Kaylee.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, evening. So for our report out for the health subcommittee, last meeting, we had a presentation from the Behavioral Health Collaborative and the Director of Behavioral Health Division, Neil Bowen, and Bryce Pittenger was the collaborative representative. So it was a pretty good meeting. The subgroup is still looking to narrow down the focuses and priorities for that. But our next meeting will be on Medicaid and a panel that's going to discuss expansion of insurance coverage, including Nicole Como and Angela Moderno of HSD. Looking forward to our last scheduled meeting. We're going to be having a few representatives to address paid sick leave and paid family sick leave. So we have Bill McCamley from Workforce Solutions Department confirmed and are awaiting confirmation from Southwest Women's Law Center for two people actually, one to present on paid sick leave and one for paid family sick leave. So that is the health subcommittee report out. And after these meetings, a little bit more pointed priorities will be addressed and navigated after we hear from the presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaylee. Any questions or comments for Kaylee and Health Committee? No? Okay. Well, for the rest of our agenda, we have time scheduled for discussion around the work groups that were created. And Amy, I don't know if you have the listing of the various work groups or if someone just wants to volunteer if your work group has met to give an update of where you're at. We wanted to check in to make sure that the work of the work groups is actually beginning as we continue to prepare to have our short-term legislative priority listing recommendations prepared for presentation next month. And so is there anyone that would like to talk about what your work group is doing? Or Amy, do you have the listing of the various work groups?
I do. I think first an update on the Regents work that Jennifer and Nancy took on for us. And then also several of you added some recommendations to that. So we did submit that to the Director of Boards and Commissions. We submitted that on Monday, and we're waiting for her to get back to us. So we haven't gotten an answer back on that yet. And then the work groups that we have is data, budget. I'm pulling up. Sorry.
It's going to be data reporting, budget, state assuming responsibility for the 4 private prisons in New Mexico, racial equity requirements, training and hiring, early childhood education using permanent land grant fund, suggesting the legislator on bills presenting racial impact assessment task force on model and training and deadly force investigation, and then lastly, making a council for racial justice permanent.
And I'll add, we also added, thank you for that, Tammy. We also added the renaming of state properties.
I can go first, talk a little bit about the one we've been working on. I believe our topic is the use of deadly force, the legislation we heard a couple of weeks ago. My group is meeting tomorrow, but in the meantime, so we'll have some more updates for everybody next time we meet. But I have been myself have been able to reach out to a few people just to gather some more information on this. I'm excited about it. I've kind of learned a lot about this topic. So I've talked to a few sheriffs. I've talked to a few chief of police. I've also talked to multiple legislators, judges, and I actually have a conversation with Judge Bacon coming up later on this week to be able to talk about this. So I don't have any conclusions right now. We're gonna talk with my group tomorrow, and hopefully next time we'll have lots of information for everybody.
That's great, Dr. Romero. Thank you for that update. It's good to know that, you know, like the work is moving forward. So thank you for that. That sounds wonderful. Anybody else have a report out or update? Has everyone volunteered for one of the work groups? Is there anyone that doesn't have a clue what I'm talking about? Okay, Janine, I see, and Charles. Out of those that Tammy listed for Janine and Charles, are there any of those groups that you would like to volunteer for? So essentially what we're doing is we've divided up into smaller work groups of 2 to 3 or 4 people that include members from the central committee as well as from the subcommittees around specific topics so that we can start to do a deeper dive and produce some writing around what the recommendations around those different topic areas may look like. And so I will actually copy these into the chat. And if there's anyone that has any updates,
I'm typing on the, oh, you got it, okay.
Oh, you
Sorry.
just copy and paste here.
This is Jennifer. I just had a question. I wanted to know if you could let us know which which work groups do not have any members.
Amy, do you have that information?
Yeah, so all of them have members. It's just, you know, at this point we have about 2 or 3 on each one.
I just wanted to say that I know that we proposed a Medicaid subgroup, and then there was some energy around that in the health subgroup, and that will probably have a little bit more direction after the next health subcommittee meeting.
So the Medicaid subgroup is not one of our work groups. It is to drill down on specific questions to ask our presenters because the Medicaid is so big. So we wanted to make sure that we had very specific questions to ask them. So that subgroup is really just for those people who have been very engaged in the health subcommittee.
Thank you for that.
Hey,
Go ahead,
sorry. Yeah, I just need to know, Amy or either Ms. Taylor, how have you sent out a list of each one that's in the same group, or have I missed that?
Yes, so we sent out an introduction email to everyone who had volunteered for the list, for the group. I can,
Okay.
I'll forward you the email again.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Hello, so this is Corrine. Can you hear me? Yes.
We can hear you.
All right, so we had a call with our working group, which is the racial justice looking at permanency for the council. What we've done so far is did a little bit of research on looking at states or other jurisdictions that have had permanent racial justice committees, workforces, or task forces. And so we're beginning to kind of look at that aspect and see what would be some of the recommendations that we could make to the governor or to this panel around suggestions on that. And on this working group sits myself, Terrence Smith, and Representative Stapleton. And that's what we've done so far.
For that update, that's super important. And Dr. Bicknell has volunteered to also serve on that work group. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. More participants.
More hands. Okay, Jacqueline says, I'm on the suggestions to legislator on bills presented working group, and we will still need to meet. Great, thank you. I really appreciate you all taking this work on. I think Amy in her message to everyone explained that we really don't have a lot of staffing capacity right now to staff all of those work groups. And so we really appreciate y'all just taking that on and providing that leadership. Senator Lopez, the group looking at racial and social justice is the one looking at the bills presented. So there's a group looking at the suggested bills presented that will include the racial impact assessments. Would you like to volunteer for that group? Great. If there are no other, okay, hold on. Training and hiring.
The racial equity requirements for training and hiring is not focused on law enforcement. Law enforcement will be a part of that, but that it's focused more on employees overall. Really kind of looking at some of the work that was started with Senator Lopez's bill and the SB 90 of last year.
Let me see, Jeff. Is there anyone else that was about to speak? Sorry. I see Jacqueline is interested in being on the work group regarding renaming state properties. Okay, I will take note of all of these in the chat as well. Great. Senator Lopez, do you want to say more about that, the racial equity requirements coming under the anti-institutional bill? And I'm wondering maybe that group maybe needs to be a part of the suggested legislation then.
Yeah, because if I just may mention for what was in the chat where it talks about racial equity requirements for training and hiring, that is under the purview of the State Personnel Office. And that was also included on Senate Bill 90, the one that we've been kind of chatting about in different contexts. And State Personnel Office did offer an amendment during special sessions. So we will include that as we kind of revamp and revise the bill for this coming session. But that is something through State Personnel Office with their hiring and training for anti-racism and all the other important requirements for training. And then, of course, that goes down to each of the state our departments who also have their own personnel office. So that's kind of where we start, and then it kind of I call it through the spokes and goes out through the rest of state government. But that will be included on that particular bill. So any suggestions, of course, is always welcome.
Thank you for that, Senator Lopez. And then is there anyone on the data and reporting or budget work group that can speak to Janine's question around what you're working on?
So I'm moving Nancy Lopez into a panelist because she is in the data group, but I don't think anyone else in the data group is here. So Nancy, are you able to give us an update on that?
How is everyone? So yes, Christopher Ramirez and I have been meeting to discuss how we can improve collecting data for racial justice that's intersectional, meaning that it's not enough to only look at race without looking at gender and class origin. And one of the things, the feedback that we received at one of our recent meetings was that we needed specific questions on tribal origin and tribal status, as well as the descendants of American slavery. And so making sure that we have this aggregated data that will really help us understand people's categories of experience in terms of disparities, whether it's law enforcement or discipline in schools or access to healthcare or housing or voting rights. So our goal is to really use critical race theory and intersectionality as the conceptual underpinnings of this data collection. And we could be leaders in the country to do this. So I'm very excited about it. We are getting feedback. We're absolutely committed to tribal sovereignty in terms of data as one of the underlying principles. Hello?
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. It looks like we may have lost your connection a bit. Janine says, sign me up. So thank you for that. Yeah, her connection is weak. And then the budget, is there anyone from budget? No. Okay. Jennifer, which subcommittee is that around the data? Okay, great. We'll note that. All right. I think if there are no other report outs at this time, I don't generally end meetings early. Are there? But because you all have volunteered for work groups, I feel like we can because you're volunteering time to other work. So we appreciate
and wait,
it.
actually, Alexandria, the two things that we heard today, if we can just kind of general conversation, if people have an interest in moving these things to a work group, is this stuff we want to hear more about? We need to gauge interest in whether those two things should be moved forward for us.
Thank you. Is there anyone that has a comment on that? I think what I've heard is both from the presentation at the last meeting around Senator Cedillo Lopez and the two representatives bill responding to excessive force. And the bill we heard today about lethal force being a part of the work group that's focused on the bills that are to be presented this session. Does that sound like those fit with the work that you're already doing? And then I don't know if we would want to add the school, since that is a bill as well that's being worked on by Senator Lopez, adding the school seclusion and restraints to that work group, or if that needs to be its own work group. I want to be cautious of creating too many work groups where we don't have enough people.
Maybe that could, I think it still has an overall, if I may say, into that group that's already working on the excessiveness of, with kind of the conversation we just had earlier, first part of our committee meeting, and the other work that's ongoing, because I think they're all related.
Mm-hmm.
The suggestion.
I wouldn't mind taking on that. I'm kind of speaking for my work group. If we want to take some of those legislative pieces and put them into this one work group, I'm okay with that. Because I think just like Senator Lopez talked about, they're all related.
Okay. Thank you for that, Dr. Romero. As long as you feel like that's doable.
We will do our best. We want to be able to give back good feedback to the committee. Absolutely.
Thank you. All right. Amy, does that get to the answer for that for you?
Yes, thank you very much.
Great. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for another meeting. And so we look forward to all of the work coming out of the work groups and the subcommittees. And we'll be back on November 4th for our next meeting. I really appreciate your devotion and your time here and sharing this space. Thank you so much for being here, and have a good evening.
If I can end on one thing, right? Because you know, Halloween is coming up, and I think many of us love Halloween as a holiday or just as a time to get together. That, you know, please make sure that you're looking at the New Mexico Department of Health website and the New Mexico Together website for some very safe ways to do Halloween during this COVID time. As you all know, our numbers have been increasing, and so we highly encourage you to make sure you're checking all of our state websites to look at some of those great ways that you can enjoy your family and your friends in safe ways as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Safe.